Special thanks to these companies for being long-term partners of this channel.
Hey everyone, welcome back to the channel. If you're new here, my name is Zach. Here we talk about overlanding, gear, DIY, builds, all sorts of stuff related to overlanding. And today we're going to be talking about a Midland MXT500 install. So Midland sent me this radio and I wanted to find a creative place to mount it because I didn't want to take up leg room. I didn't want to block my sight on my dash mount. And it's a pretty big radio, so we've got an idea kind of brewing here where we're going to mount it. So let's jump right into the video. First I'm going to talk about unboxing it, then we're going to talk about all the stuff you got to do to the radio so that it will fit where we're going to put it, and then we'll actually install it in the rig. So thank you so much for watching. If you support me, I really appreciate your support. If you don't already, consider subscribing to the channel. It really helps me out, helps the channel grow. So let's jump right in.
Okay, so before we actually install this on the 4Runner, I just want to do a little unboxing, talk about what comes in the packaging, and then we'll jump into the install. So before I open up this box though, I just do want to mention they also, in addition to sending this to me completely for free, just want to say that it was a sponsored product, they did send me this universal trunk lip mount extender cable. If you've seen my video on the other radio I got from Midland, I got one of these as well from them, as well as this flexible antenna. So this is their 5 dB antenna, and I actually love the one I have currently on my vehicle. I just asked them if I could have a second one for the Land Cruiser. So thank you so much, Midland, for sending that out to me. So let's jump right into unboxing this. I just wanted to also grab my old radio out of my vehicle to show you size comparisons. So I did do that. So once I've got this kind of unboxed, we'll go through, comparing the two. So right off the bat here, this is a little bit larger than the older MXT175 I had. I never tried out their 40 watt version of this, but this 50 watt one it's a pretty big boy. It's good size. We've got a lot of cooling here on the front, or I think this would be the bottom technically, on the bottom and the back. On the back we've got this antenna port, and then we also have this INT port. I'm not quite sure what that is. This is going to be a power plug for sure. And then up front here, this is where your radio handheld will connect. Also under this little rubber, I guess door, we'll call it, you've got a USB-C port. So that's pretty sweet if you are using some of the modern phones. A lot of them use USB-C ports. So this probably has a decent sized transformer inside of it, and they allow you to use that power to plug a phone cable in. So pretty slick if you don't have a cigarette adapter. But let's just set that aside. We've got a little GMRS two-way radio book, a quick start guide, a couple of stickers. So that's all sweet. Let's see what else do we have in here. We'll go for this handheld. So handheld, unfortunately, doesn't have any sort of display on it. It's just a, I think it's, oh, it looks like it's got up and down channel buttons, and then it has this accordion style cable, and then your typical handheld microphone like this. So we've got this included power cable here, and this is pretty slick because one side has this waterproof plug which will plug right into this plug from the radio, and then we have an inline fuse and a black and red connection. So if you've got a Blue Seas panel, kind of like I do, you should be able to just run this straight to that fuse box and then have power all the time. Just to check out the couple last things in here, we've got this little antenna. I don't think I'll be using this because this antenna is probably not that great, and they sent me that awesome 5 dB gain one, so I will totally use that, but probably a decent option if you don't have the antenna that I do. So this is pretty slick. It's a long cable with for the antenna port, and then on the other side it's got this big heavy-duty magnet with a port for screwing on these antennas. I think this would work just as fine also with the 5 dB gain antenna they sent with me as well, but I already have a mounting point I will use probably on a rack or a bumper, so I don't necessarily need this, but this might be pretty slick. You've got kind of like a matching magnetic plate. Ooh, ouch, just pinched my skin in there. That's a strong magnet. And then it's got 3M adhesive on this side, so good grief. that is a really strong magnet. Okay, so that will work quite well if you need a mounting solution for this antenna. But let's set that aside. The last couple things that are in this packaging is just this mounting bracket. Haven't quite decided how I want to mount this in the 4Runner, so we're going to have to look at some options. And then on top of the mounting bracket, we've got a couple of different types of screws here, some of which I'm sure work to screw into the side here on these different mounting points. And then we've got another one of those plastic 3M handheld clips. So hopefully this is compatible to my old one, so I can just leave the current one I have on my Rago Fabrication dash mount, and then this one I can use in the Land Cruiser. So that would be awesome. All right, so I set everything aside, and now I just want to show the difference between this newer MXT500 to the MXT175 I was previously using. This is, well, it's got its bracket on it, but as you can tell, they are two very different size radios. Just to compare these two handhelds, so and then if we can get this to focus in, this is the new handheld, and it has this like 8-pin, 8-hole connector, whereas the old one just had an Ethernet plug. So that was pretty handy for just having the Ethernet plug, because as some of you maybe saw, I used one of those Ethernet pass-throughs to be able to hide the radio and then plug this in right near my dash. But unfortunately, we're not going to be able to do that, so this is probably going to need to be mounted somewhere much closer to the driver. But that's the MXT500. All right, so remember how we were talking about the MXT500 radio? Well, I'm trying to figure out where to mount this thing, one of them being inside of this plastic. Now, I went and I did a bit of cutting with my Dremel, and I just want to show you kind of my approach. So you're going to need a cutout of roughly 5.5 inches wide. So, and you have to round out some of the sides here for the screws on the side of the mounts. So if you notice, these mounts here have these little screws, and that's how that bracket mounts up. So this is about 5.5 inches wide, but the screws make it even a little bit wider. So you just have to make sure there's enough space for these to sit on the sides. Now, another thing I did is this is how I mounted the screws on the bracket, because it gives you the maximum pushback of this bracket here. Because if you didn't notice, it's got this ginormous radiator in the back, which has its pros and its cons. It's actually really nice, because what we're gonna do is if you want to mount this in this plastic, you're gonna have to jam this thing way back as far as you can, and this is going to be pushing on the ductwork for your heating and cooling in the vehicle. So having this to push against is really nice, because it allows you to have some, you know, kind of pre-spoken for space for your wires to be routed, and then that means you're not gonna bend this really hard and potentially hurt this electrical connection. So another thing is we have on order a right angle attachment here, so that you can connect your antenna without having problems of it pushing into that ductwork. So, and then just to kind of give another helpful measurement, this is about 7 inches deep. If you include the knobs, it's about 7.5 to 7.75. When we mount this up, this turn dial and your handheld mic plug-in are going to be kind of right over the space for your front cup holder. And then this part right here, this dial, I think should clear the 4-wheel drive handle, but I haven't quite tested that yet. Anyways, I don't actually plan on mounting it in here, but I just wanted to show this to some of you, because maybe you don't really care about that front cup holder and you really want this to mount in here. I just wanted to show that it can be done. And, you know, I'm a big fan of just coming up with fun ideas of stuff to do. And sometimes I don't even go through with them, but I wanted to show you all that this is a possibility. It's just going to take a little bit of custom work. And so, as you can see, it does stick out a little ways from the plastic, but it still is totally doable. And the plastic on the bottom and the back here kind of follows the contour of that ductwork like I was mentioning. So that's why you are really going to have to kind of jam this in, because this portion needs to kind of push into the ductwork a little bit. So if you can just picture that. And then I'll show you the back of this plastic. So if we take out the radio. This is kind of the Dremel work that I did to cut this out. See if I can get the best angle here. So right in here, there was a little piece of, I think it was like just a plastic piece that was like framing for it. You'll notice that there's always these little plastic tabs, kind of like right here. It's just structural plastic for this molding. So I cut a couple of those out. Here's another one right here. And then as you can see, I cut out a little half circle here so that the screw can pass by. Same with up here. I had to trim down this plastic piece right up here because it was a little bit too tall. So I cut that down a little bit, but I tried to leave it as best I can. These little plastic clips are really helpful. They're structural. These are gonna be where your anchoring is with the bolts. So this is probably the most important, but I tried to keep these, you know, as structurally sound as I could because I'd like them to still do their job. Additionally, as you can see, these clips on the top here, they're not really in the way at all, so you can still push the radio fully in. It's not gonna hit those clips. This little portion here, I couldn't help but break. So I'm gonna use some JB Weld to just plastic glue right there, and that should do its job again. So that's kind of how you cut it out if you wanna put the radio in there. I wish I could give better instruction, but essentially what I did is if you remember, this is what it used to look like. This kind of sits in here and has the little switch. So we're going to be relocating this little data switch. This USB port is basically worthless. It's more for data transfer than actually charging. So who really cares if we get rid of that? And I don't use the auxiliary cable anymore, but we're just relocating it. We're not getting rid of it, so no worries there. So that was plugged in here. And then we had this cigarette port that went right here. So what I did is I just cut along the bottom of that port and then tried to follow the circular part of the cigarette port up here. And actually, if you do that, it, for the most part, centers the radio in this space. So worked pretty well. Cut that out. The cigarette port's kind of handy, but there's a bunch of extra ones. There's one in your center console where your arm rests. There's also one in your glove box. So I really didn't worry too much about losing this. I'm gonna be putting in a different switch panel here. So if you made it this far into the video, that was the unbox therapy version of opening this Midland MXT500. Now we're gonna get into the pretty hardcore DIY portion of the video. So what I'm doing right now is I'm basically cutting apart the connector on the handheld mic. And this is pretty uncharted territory. I didn't know anywhere online what this mapped out to. This may be fairly standardized, but even if it is standardized, it's hard to know which wires are what under this insulation. So I took a very big risk and sort of a leap of faith and just crossed my fingers that these wires would be colored. And lo and behold, they were colored. So once I got enough insulation out of the way, I started to cut everything back so that I could figure out which colored wire was connected to which pin on the actual cable connector. So maybe you noticed there's this little blue port on the back. I don't know what that was for, but I just took note of all the colors and where they were connected to each pin. Next, I had to remove the other port. So we cut the port off of the handheld mic, but now I needed to remove the plastic port on the actual front of the radio. So removing the front of the radio to this point is actually pretty easy. You just back out some screws on the back, which is pretty intuitive, and it exposes this front panel. And then you have to unclip this power cable, which you can see kind of dangling in the air, and you have to unclip a ribbon cable, which is held in by that little black clip, which is surrounding that like 30 or 40 pin connector that's right next to my soldering iron. If you're paying close attention, the spots along those 8 pins where it looks really shiny, that's areas where I've basically removed all the solder from the pins. And then all the spots where it looks a little bit darker, that's where there's actually still a cone of solder around the through hole component. So I still have to remove the solder there. I actually was not able to remove the front port solely with just removing the solder, though I do think it really helps to preserve the printed circuit board. Once I had removed all this solder, I began cutting out the front port because I found out that actually this printed circuit board is held into the front panel through all of the through-hole components. So you really have to unsolder a ton of things in order to remove this board, as well as removing screws and other things. So I decided it would be easier for me to just cut out the plastic connector than actually have to unsolder and resolder all of the different switches and buttons and everything. So that's what I did, and it took a little while to do that, but with just some careful Dremel work, I was able to remove that front port. There seems to be some sort of plastic lip on the underside of this ledge within the port, so just be sure that once you get towards the end, you are going to have to do some sort of shimmying to remove that plastic under the edge. And you'll know what I mean once you start cutting out the port. So originally what my plan was to remove that port and then put in this. So this right here is a 90-degree port connected to one of these connectors. And I'd like to call this a female and I'd like to call this a male, but they're kind of like both female and male connectors at the same time. So it's kind of weird. I don't really know exactly what to call them, but this 90-degree angle was going to go right here on the top because this needs to clear the armrest when it closes. So we needed this to be a very sharp turn. And then this is what I was going to solder in to that board. And so the problem was though, is all these little pins are just slightly farther spaced apart than the old Midland one. The Midland one is like an 8-pin connector just like this, but it seems to be proprietary or something. It's like a mini version of this. And I couldn't find anywhere online where I could find one of these. So if you can find one and you can do it this way, then awesome. But I struggled to find these sorts of things. And so this doesn't, solder into there appropriately. Now, let's see how these have like almost a little half pipe in them. They're like a half circle and they've got a little channel in there. So my thought was as well, in theory, you could probably feed some sort of pin inside of there, solder that pin, and then the pin would fit through the PCB. Maybe that would work, maybe it wouldn't, but the problem is it starts to shim the port up. So if we zoom back out, we don't want this port to stick out too far because it completely defeats the purpose of this right angle then. So what I just decided to do was solder the wires straight to the board because now we're gonna have a great connection. You don't have to worry about these different connections here. I don't know a lot about electrical communication wiring, but I do know that typically these sorts of connections can be a source of noise or just interference or feedback. So I figured to remove these would potentially help the signal. So I soldered these directly into the PCB and I color-coded all of the wires similar to the previous wiring that was there. So to break it down, so I cut it open and all of these cables were colored except for the black one. The black wire is just exposed wire. But what I did is I basically mapped out all of those colors onto where I thought they went. So one of the ports on this had a little blue color when I cut it open, so that was this one. And so then that blue port was connected to a yellow wire, and then we have a white, black, red, brown, blue, and green wire, and there's a gray wire in the middle. And then the white and black wire has like this super thin aluminum foil around it, and that's to shield those wires. And then I drew out the back of this PCB. So this PCB, if you look at it from behind the display, all of those little holes are labeled except for the middle one, which is why I called it NA. So then what I did is I translated all of that to the front of the radio. So if you can see here, this says mic and mic ground. On this side, it's flip-flopped, so I just had to do a mirror image so that what these labels looked like on the back would essentially be labeled on the front. So this front of the radio has all of these ports. And then what I did is I took all of my colors I recorded from the handheld and mapped them onto this exact same layout. So roughly the white wire goes to the mic, the black wire goes to the mic ground, and then we've got a red, a brown, a blue, a green, a yellow wire, and then the middle was gray. I didn't have a gray wire in the little pack of wires I bought, so I just called that a pink wire. And so now all we need to do is make sure that these wire colors stay consistent through each connection. So if you look on the front of my radio here, I've soldered all of those wires just like how I mentioned. Right up here on the front, we've got a black, and then there's a red and a brown wire, and then it goes to a blue wire, just like how my little drawing says. So all of these are that way, and then I tried to wrap aluminum foil around the black and white wires, which were shielded. It worked out all right. I had to put a lot of electrical tape along there to prevent like cracking and stuff. There's probably a better way to shield the wire. Might look into it in the future if it causes feedback or there's some sort of issues with the radio handheld. But for now, it's okay. So I'm gonna leave it this way. And so then what I did is I created that wire about 4 to 5 feet long. And so that's why it's wrapped around here. I have some protective wiring now that I'm going to put over this wire so that it is just a little bit more protected, and hopefully it can prevent any cracking of this aluminum foil. So I made about a 5 foot length, maybe 6 foot length piece. And this is gonna feed from the radio and the armrest up to the front panel on my dash right below my head unit. So let's check that out now. So you've probably seen the video where I talked about this rocker switch install, and this is why I left one blank panel in, was for this port right here. So this port isn't really stuck in too tight. You could put some plastic weld or something on the back if you really wanted to. I'm kind of hoping that maybe you can fit it through if you ever need to take this plastic piece off, but that's probably not going to be possible once you solder up all of the wires to this. So on the back here, this little port has all of the spots that we need to solder these colored wires at the end of this wire. So I'm going to figure out, roughly how long this cable needs to be, put some heat shrink on this. I've got a grommet to put in this hole, and then hopefully the wires and everything should be really nice and protected. We can run it through the center console area up to this plastic part, and it's going to be fairly permanent, which is the only downside of soldering these wires straight to this board, because everything's soldered. There's no quick connects, but I think it's going to be a really nice and good electrical connection. So for that part, I'm pretty thankful, I guess. That's what we're going to do. So now we just have to keep on doing some soldering, and then we can put this panel back on the front of the Midland radio and mount it up in the vehicle. I do want to mention though that in addition to soldering up the wire to get to this connector, we also need to put a new port on the handheld so that it can actually plug into this appropriately. So what I've done is I've cut the insulation back just a little bit to expose all of these wires. This is the heat shrink and the protector metal piece that goes on the back of the port to just protect all of these soldered points so they don't bend around. And so now what we just need to do is solder all of these little connectors right onto this female or male end, whatever you would call this. So once we solder all these connections, then we'll put the screws in to pull this shield up, and it should be good to go and work just like new. So I just soldered all of these wires onto the connector. So now what we're going to do is slide up this piece of heat shrink. Hopefully it fits around here well enough. I'm going to hit this with a heat gun quick. I'm careful to not get too close to those connections, because if I do, it's going to potentially melt the solder. All right, they look to be okay. So now what we're going to do is we're going to slide this connector over this heat shrink. There we go. So one side has this little groove right here. This side has this little groove. So we make sure that these holes are going to line up. On the back side, there's this little tongue and groove that it needs to line up with. So that's what I'm going to rotate to. This little thing slides in there, and then it turns. Once we turn that, our little hole will line up on this side. There we go. Okay, so now this is pretty well solid. Now what we're gonna do is put this right over the top of this heat shrink here. I put this piece of heat shrink in there just so that this would have something tight to pull against and it wouldn't be flopping all over the place. So let's tighten down both these screws. All right, so we've got both sides anchored down. This feels really solid. Hopefully the electrical connections are all good. And then I was just gonna put this little piece of heat shrink over the top of this just for an additional solidifier. I don't know. Probably not necessary. There we go. So now we should have a fully functioning radio and the plug all good to go. Sorry, the focus is jumping around so much. And this is what we'll plug into our little port that's up front. Additionally, I did finish making this harness as well. So unfortunately, I can't solder the connector onto this end until I've threaded it through where it needs to go. But I just used a variety of pieces of heat shrink instead of that grommet to make this little turn here. So this should be good. And as you can see, it doesn't stick up very high, which is what we want. So now we can just connect this back onto the radio and get it ready so that we can mount this inside the armrest of the 4Runner. So just in case any of you are interested in this part of putting this back together, we have to run this little ribbon cable in to the front panel, and this part kind of just goes through like that, and then we need to hook it into this little whatever number pin connector this is. These aren't anything super fancy, so all we have to do is push it into the opening and then press down, and that should be good enough to get it secured. So I'm gonna do that now. Okay, so my head was probably a little bit in the way there, but basically what you do is you push the ribbon cable in far enough so that there's no blue showing when you have the little black clip pulled out, but once you push it in, which like pushes pressure on the ribbon cable, then that should show just a little bit of blue and you should be good to go. That should be plugged in. So now I'm gonna run this cable back over to the power port where it goes. This is the part that you have to be careful about right when you first take apart the radio, because if you pull it out too fast, you could rip this power cable off. There we go. So the top of it kind of hooks on there. As you can see, I broke one of the clips. This ribbon cable should be fine now. And this power cable has no slack. Just comes straight across. Plug that in like that. So we've got a few different screws here, but I've got these 3 screws laying over here. It's very easy to keep the screws all separate. They're all very different. Once you get one of these threaded, then you should be just fine. I'm just trying to keep everything in place, and so it's kind of hard to hold on to everything. I'm gonna put 1 screw in just to hold it and then flip it back over and get everything else plugged in and good to go. And finish putting the rest of this together. Let's put this rubber seal back inside its little tray. Need to make sure to plug in this little speaker, and that plugs in right down here. Gonna orient this 90-degree plug towards the center console area. So that's what we want. So now we can flip this back over, start threading in some of these Allens. And if you're wondering what size Allen this is, it's a 2.5 metric. Alrighty. So we've got all of the bolts tightened down. Everything is put back in normal order like it came from the factory. Except for that port has changed quite a bit. Okay, so this is the first plan of action. You need to mark inside of here where you want to put the radio. So in my case, and probably why you're watching this video, I set the radio inside of here. You can kind of see the lip. So mark on the plastic, where that lip is, and then we're going to take the mount off and put screws in. So I got it mounted up, so you can see, and it fits great, honestly. I'm really happy with how it turned out. There's space right there on the left to slide by the coin holder so that wire can be fed right down through there. It's pretty easy to pull the radio in and out from the mount right there. And those screws work quite well. They didn't poke out on the side over here at all. And I just put in 2 and I eyeballed the height. There's a fair amount of adjustability on the Midland radio mount to go front and back, which in our case is up and down. So that's really to our benefit, because if you have any issues, finding the perfect height, it's more important that you just mount it level rather than, a little higher or lower, because you can adjust that. And so all we're going to be doing is pushing it down as far as we can in the mount. All right, so there is the bracket all mounted up, and now we're just going to route some of those cables down through the hole that I've already drilled in the bottom. Note the orientation of these little notches. So that's important, because if you mount it upside down, you're going to have a hard time sliding this into place. Okay, so I ran my power cable, and then I also pre-fed that cable that I custom made to come out of the port, and then I put in all of the screws and tightened them all down. So now I just need to put the radio in there, and then I'll show kind of how we can better route those cables. Similarly, this is the antenna cable that I routed that's identical to my previous radio from Midland. This is from the MXT500. I'm just going to use the exact same cable since it's already routed back to my antenna on my Rago fabrication mount. I'll link the video up in the top right corner if you want to go check that video out. Okay, so we've got the cables all routed. That yellow cable is an Ethernet cable from my old radio, so don't worry about that. I do have a little extra slack from my antenna cable, which is just fine. I'll just kind of clean that up in the bottom. You could easily push that to be routed under your seat or something. Yeah, this is looking pretty sweet. I'm really happy how this mounted up. Then we're just going to need to sneak a little, I don't know what that is, 8mm or something, or I don't know, some small socket on the sides there just to tighten up those screws so that that radio doesn't bounce around in the mount at all. Okay, so there's the radio. We ran the cables down the side there, and then I've just followed them all the way up this wiring harness right here next to my yellow cable, and then they've come out the front of the dash here. So we've got the red and black cable. That's the power cable that's going to be going up to the engine bay just for power to the radio. That'll come off my Blue Seas. And then we've got that braided cable there. That's the 8 colored cable that we're going to be using to plug into my port that should be right under these climate controls. So let's go grab that plastic piece insert that's got the switches in it and start installing that.
So it's the next day, and I was able to route a cable in from my engine bay, and this is the power cable. So all I'm doing here is soldering the wires between the power cable that was supplied with the Midland radio and the high quality harness that I made that goes from this power cable to my engine bay to hook up to my Blue Seas fuse box. So that's all I'm doing here, and like you maybe saw in my other switch video, my audio didn't work this day when I was working on this stuff, so I'm just gonna have to voice it over. So at this point, I've actually ran the wire through the hole on the front of my rocker switch panel, and I just need to solder these wires up to the back of my port. And so all we have to do is strip off the insulation on all of these colored wires and run a piece of heat shrink before we start soldering up these wires to the port.
So, and just to give a little final look, the radio turned out really clean. Like I had mentioned in the video, I had to trim this little organizer in the back some. As you can see, the little like incline or whatever on the back can be problematic, so I had to trim that, but I think it turned out really nice. And as you can see, it opens and closes perfectly fine. There we go. So we hold it down to turn it on. My display has been acting a little funky right here, but I'm not worried about that. I think it just was a problem when I cut this out with my Dremel. Some sort of dust got over here, so it seems to be messing with the screen a little bit, but it's not too bad. If I press my mic button on my radio, works great. You can see that little red light turn on. If I do channel up, it goes up. If I do channel down, it goes down. So my handheld is working great, so my little pass-through cable is working. Last thing I need to do is just check to make sure that I can actually talk to someone, but it should be good. So there's the little port for the handheld, and I'm just hanging it right there on my Rago fabrication mount. So super clean. Really happy how it turned out.
Well, that's going to be a wrap for this video. Thank you so much for watching. It means a lot if you watch until the end of my videos. And consider liking the video because that really helps me out and helps the channel grow. And if you're not subscribed, I'd really heavily consider you to subscribe because, you know, I post videos weekly and I think the content's unique and pretty cool. So thank you so much for watching, and until next time, I'll catch you all in the next video.